The crazy part is that we can put robots on Mars, but we cannot replicate the Shroud of Turin.
There was something unique about the image on the shroud, something that was not typical of any other images that any of us were familiar with.
Barrie Schwortz desperately tried to walk away from this project twice, telling himself it was not his problem. He was Jewish, after all. Why would he care about this relic? But the shroud would not let him go. Then a top specialist from NASA told him something that changed his life forever. Get this. They proved that no technology in human history could produce this image. It is not that simple, though. The latest genetic data suggests the cloth has been everywhere at once. Experts discover an image with three-dimensional data. The team arrived in Turin with crates of the most advanced equipment available in the late 1970s. They had ultraviolet cameras, infrared sensors, and a very special piece of hardware called the VP8 image analyzer. This was a machine used by NASA to map the topography of planets. If you put a normal photograph into a VP8, the image comes out distorted because the machine tries to turn light and dark into height and depth. Since a normal photo only has 2 dimensions, the result is a messy blob. But when they put a photo of the Shroud of Turin into that analyzer, the room went silent. The image that appeared on the monitor was a perfect, anatomically correct 3-dimensional human form. This meant that the information on the cloth was not just a picture, it was a topographic map of a human body. It was like the cloth had recorded depth and distance from the body it covered. Nobody had ever seen anything like it in the history of art. Schwortz spent hours leaning over the cloth, looking through high-powered microscopes at the individual fibers. He was looking for the telltale signs of a painter. He looked for brushstrokes, for clumps of pigment, for any sign that a human hand had applied color to the linen. He found nothing. The image was only on the very top surface of the fibers, thinner than a human hair. There was no capillary action, which means no liquid had ever soaked into the fabric to create the image. If you had used paint or dye, the liquid would have traveled deep into the threads. But this image was like a whisper on the surface. It was a key detail that made his heart race. He began to realize that if this was a fake, it was a fake created with technology that did not exist in the Middle Ages. In fact, it was technology that did not exist in 1978 either. He was a Jewish man who felt like an outsider in this investigation. He told himself he had no horse in this race. Why should he care about a Christian artifact? He even tried to quit the team because the implications were becoming too heavy. He went to his colleague, Don Lin, who was a top imaging specialist from NASA. Schwortz asked him why a Jewish guy like him was even on the team. Lin looked him in the eyes and reminded him that Jesus was Jewish too. He told Schwortz to do his best work and let the truth speak for itself. That conversation was a turning point. Schwortz stopped looking for a way to debunk it and started looking for a way to explain it. But the more they tested, the less they could explain. They found that the image was not a scorch. It was not a photograph. It was not a painting. It was something else entirely. The mystery was no longer about religious belief. It was about a physical impossibility sitting right in front of them. The team worked for 5 days straight, 24 hours a day, in shifts. They barely slept. They were driven by a desperate need to find a natural explanation. They checked for every chemical known to man. They looked for minerals, for salts, for organic compounds that might have reacted with the linen. They found some iron oxide, but it was only associated with the blood areas, not the image itself. The image itself was a mystery. It appeared to be a form of oxidation or dehydration of the cellulose in the linen fibers. Essentially, the cloth had aged faster in some spots than in others to create the picture. But how do you do that with such precision that you create a perfect human anatomy? It made no sense. This was, for starters, just the tip of the iceberg. As the investigation moved from Italy back to the laboratories in the United States, the pressure began to build. The STURP team was composed of physicists, chemists, and imaging experts. They were not theologians. They were people who dealt in facts. They published their work in peer-reviewed journals, which is a big deal in the scientific world. It means other scientists checked their methods and found them solid. They concluded that the shroud was not a painting and that the image was a mystery. But the public wanted more. They wanted to know who the man on the cloth was. Schwortz was still holding on to his skepticism, though it was wearing thin. He still had one major problem that kept him from believing the cloth was real. It was a problem that would take another 18 years to solve. Forensic evidence was pointing toward a real human being who had suffered a horrific physical ordeal. The marks on the shroud matched the descriptions of a Roman whipping. There were over 120 lash marks across the back and legs. There were puncture wounds around the head and holes in the wrists and feet. This was not just a symbol. This was a record of trauma, but the blood was the wrong color. And get this, that one detail almost caused Barrie Schwortz to walk away forever. Laboratory tests reveal a non-human origin. The blood on the shroud was red. To any photographer or forensic expert, that was a massive red flag. When blood dries and ages, it turns brown or black because the hemoglobin breaks down. If the shroud was 2,000 years old, the blood should be dark and crusty, not a vibrant red. Schwortz used this fact to anchor himself in his skepticism. He told himself that some artist must have used red paint to make the blood look fresh. He believed this for years, even as the rest of the data suggested the cloth was authentic. It was his safety net. If the blood was fake, the whole thing could still be a fraud. It is not that simple, though. In 1995, he got a call that changed everything. The man on the phone was Dr. Alan Adler, a world-class biochemist and blood expert. Adler was also Jewish and had a reputation for being incredibly tough and rigorous. He asked Schwortz why he was still holding out. Schwortz told him about the red color of the blood. Adler laughed. He explained that they had already tested the blood and it was definitely real human blood. It was type AB, which is relatively rare. But more importantly, he explained why it was still red. When a human body goes through extreme, prolonged physical trauma, the liver starts to produce a huge amount of bilirubin. This chemical floods the bloodstream as a survival response. And get this, blood that is high in bilirubin stays red forever. It does not turn brown. It stays as bright as the day it left the body. This was a wow factor that Barrie Schwortz never saw coming. It meant that the blood on the shroud was not just real, it was the blood of someone who had been tortured to the absolute limit of human endurance. The chemistry of the blood itself was a witness to the suffering of the man who had been wrapped in that cloth. The forensic details were incredibly specific. The blood flows on the arms showed that the man had to change positions while hanging to breathe. The blood around the head showed that sharp objects had pierced the scalp. The blood from the side wound was a mixture of blood and clear fluid, which happens when the heart fails after a massive physical shock. Every single drop of blood told a story of a real, physical event. It was not art. It was a crime scene. Schwortz realized that he had been looking at the color of the blood through the lens of a healthy person. He had not considered the chemistry of a dying person. This realization hit him hard. For 18 years, he had used a piece of information he did not fully understand to protect himself from the truth. Now, that safety net was gone. The blood was real. The trauma was real. The image was an impossibility. So, here is the deal. If the blood was real and the image was not a painting, how did the image get there? This is where the theories start to get wild. Some scientists have suggested that the image was formed by a burst of radiation or light. They have tried to replicate it using powerful lasers, and they have managed to get close, but only by using equipment that requires an incredible amount of energy. Think about this for a second. To create that image on a piece of linen, you would need a flash of energy more powerful than anything available in the ancient world. You would need something that could change the surface of the fibers without burning through the cloth. It is like a photographic negative that was created without a camera. It is a key detail that points toward an event that science cannot fully describe. Some researchers call it a flash of resurrection light. Others call it an anomalous energy discharge. But whatever it was, it left a permanent mark on a piece of fabric that has survived for centuries. The crazy part is that we still cannot do it today with all our computers and technology. The silence from the academic world was deafening. After the STURP team published their findings, there were no major rebuttals. No one could find the paint. No one could explain the three-dimensional data. No one could debunk the blood chemistry. So, they just stopped talking about it. It was too uncomfortable. It challenged the standard narrative of history and science. But Schwortz was not done. He had spent decades collecting data, and he wanted the world to see it. He wanted to make sure that the evidence was available to everyone, not just those behind locked laboratory doors. He began to see his role as a protector of the data. He was the one who had the photographs. He was the one who had the microscopic evidence. He was the one who knew the truth was much stranger than fiction. But here is the catch. Just when he thought the mystery had reached its limit, a new field of science emerged. DNA testing became a reality. Researchers realized they could look at the very building blocks of life hidden within the fibers of the shroud. They expected to find the genetic footprints of a few medieval monks and some Italian locals. What they actually found was a genetic puzzle that spanned the entire globe. It was as if the cloth had traveled to places that no one ever suspected. The results were so strange that the researchers were almost afraid to tell anyone what they had discovered. Biochemistry confirms this was real blood. The DNA analysis of the Shroud of Turin started as an attempt to identify contamination. When you have a piece of cloth that has been touched by thousands of people over hundreds of years, you expect to find a mess. You expect to find skin cells, hair, and oils from everyone who ever handled it. And they did find those things. They found DNA from Western Europe, which makes sense because the cloth has been in France and Italy for a long time. But as they dug deeper into the samples taken from the dust and fibers, they found genetic markers that simply did not belong. They found sequences from the Middle East, which was expected. But then, they found markers from India. They found DNA from East Asia. They found sequences from the Caucasus region. It was like the cloth had a passport that was stamped in every corner of the ancient world. This is a key detail because it challenges the idea that the shroud is just a medieval European fake. If it was made in Europe in the 1300s, why does it have DNA from plants and people in India and the Middle East? One theory is that the cloth was made from linen that was traded across the Silk Road. Another theory is that the shroud spent a long time in the East before it ever showed up in Europe. Some researchers believe it is the same cloth known in history as the image of Edessa, or the Mandelion, which was kept in what is now Turkey for hundreds of years. The DNA evidence supports a long, complicated journey that predates its arrival in France. What most people do not realize is that the genetic data acts like a geographic record, and that record points toward a history that is much older than the skeptics want to admit. But there was something even more disturbing in the DNA reports. When scientists tried to isolate the blood DNA, they ran into a wall. The samples were degraded, which is normal for something that old. But the way they were degraded was unusual. Some sequences appeared to be incomplete in a way that defied normal biological patterns. It was almost as if the DNA had been subjected to something that altered its structure. Remember that theory about a burst of radiation or energy creating the image? Some geneticists have quietly wondered if that same energy could have damaged the DNA in a specific way. Yeah, about that. It is a theory that most mainstream labs do not want to touch because it moves into the realm of the impossible. Barrie Schwortz watched all of this from the sidelines, providing the high-resolution images that the researchers needed. He saw the confusion in the scientific community. He saw the way some researchers would get excited about a finding and then suddenly go quiet when they realized the implications. There is a lot of politics in science, especially when it comes to something as controversial as the Shroud of Turin. No one wants to be the person who says they found proof of a miracle. It is a career ender. So, the researchers use words like anomalous and unexplained. They drip-feed the information and avoid making big claims. But the data does not lie. The DNA is there, and it does not fit the medieval forgery narrative. And get this, some of the most recent tests have found DNA from a wide variety of plant species. They found pollen from plants that only grow in the area around Jerusalem. They found pollen from plants that grow in the deserts of Jordan. They found traces of plants from the mountains of Turkey. This means the cloth had to be physically present in those locations at some point in its history. You cannot paint pollen onto a cloth with that kind of diversity and accuracy. especially not in the Middle Ages when people did not even know what pollen was. This is the kind of evidence that powerful institutions would prefer stayed buried forever. It is hard data that points toward a first-century Palestinian origin. Schwortz realized that the shroud was not just a piece of fabric, it was a data storage device. It had recorded the three-dimensional shape of a man, the chemical signature of his blood, the geographic path of his journey, and the genetic markers of the world he moved through. It was a cohesive tale full of information, and every piece of that information was consistent. The blood matched the image. The image matched the three-dimensional data. The pollen matched the DNA. Everything was pointing toward a single conclusion, but the scientific world was still stuck in its uncomfortable silence. They were waiting for a piece of evidence that would definitively prove it was a fake. But that evidence never came. Instead, every new test only made the mystery more profound. The frustration was building for everyone involved. The skeptics were frustrated because they could not prove it was a fraud. The believers were frustrated because science would not call it a miracle. And the people in the middle, like Barrie Schwortz, were just trying to keep up with the overwhelming amount of data. He decided that the only way to handle it was to make it all public. He was tired of the misleading media reports and the sensational headlines. He wanted people to see the microscopic photos for themselves. He wanted them to read the peer-reviewed papers. He knew that the only way to protect the truth was to give it to the people. But that was before the DNA report arrived at his door. Anomalous DNA samples terrify the lead researchers. When the latest DNA results started coming in, the atmosphere in the research circles shifted from curiosity to genuine concern. We are talking about top-tier geneticists who have worked on some of the most famous archaeological cases in history. They were used to seeing strange things, but the Shroud of Turin was different. The DNA markers they found were not just geographically diverse. They were concentrated in ways that suggested a deliberate distribution. It was not like someone had just sneezed on the cloth. It was like the cloth had absorbed the genetic essence of the environments it had passed through. But here is the catch. Some of the sequences did not match any known population database. They were anomalies that should not exist in a natural biological sample. One lead researcher privately told Barrie Schwortz that she did not even want to know what some of the sequences meant. There was a fear that the DNA might reveal something that fundamentally challenges our understanding of human history or biology. If the DNA is corrupted by a high-energy event, what does that say about the event itself? If the genetic markers point to a person who does not fit into any standard ethnic category, who was that person? These are the kind of questions that make scientists very nervous. They prefer neat, tidy explanations that fit into existing boxes. The Shroud of Turin refuses to stay in its box. It is a constant reminder that there are things in this world that science cannot yet grasp. The crazy part is that the more we learn about genetics, the more mysterious the shroud becomes. We used to think that a simple DNA test would solve the mystery. We thought it would tell us exactly where the man was from and when he lived. But instead of providing an answer, the DNA gave us 1,000 new questions. It showed us a global journey and a biological anomaly. It showed us that the cloth is a witness to a history that is much more complex than we ever imagined. What most people do not realize is that the scientific establishment is not just confused. They are actively avoiding the topic. They are worried about their reputations and their funding. They do not want to be associated with something that sounds like a conspiracy theory, even if the data is solid. Barrie Schwortz saw this avoidance firsthand. He saw major journals refuse to publish papers on the shroud, even when the research was flawless. He saw universities turn down requests for further testing. It was a wall of silence designed to protect the status quo. But he had his own platform. He had Shroud.com. He had millions of people who were hungry for the truth. He began to realize that the shroud was a mystery that belonged to the public, not just to the experts. He continued to upload the data, the photos, and the reports. He made sure that the anomalous DNA findings were documented, even if the mainstream media would not touch them. He knew that one day, science would catch up to the evidence. And the image was formed by an unknown energy and the DNA is anomalous. The very way the blood is attached to the fibers is strange. In some areas, the blood is under the image, and in other areas, it is on top. This suggests that the blood was on the cloth before the image was formed. If a human artist had made the shroud, they would have painted the image first, and then added the blood. But the shroud shows the opposite. It shows a real body that was wrapped in a cloth while it was still bleeding. Then, at some point later, the image was created around the blood. It is a sequence of events that only makes sense if you are looking at a real burial. It does not make sense for a forgery. This brings us back to the core of the mystery.
If this is a real burial cloth, and the image was formed by an unknown energy and the DNA is anomalous, then we are looking at the most important artifact in human history.
We are looking at a physical record of an event that changed the world. And that is exactly why the scientific world is so afraid. To accept the shroud as authentic is to accept that there are limits to our scientific understanding. It is to accept that there is a realm of reality that we cannot measure with our current tools. For a man like Barrie Schwortz, who spent his life in the world of technical photography and hard data, this was a difficult realization. But he followed the evidence. He did not let his own biases get in the way of the facts. The investigation into the Shroud of Turin is far from over. New technologies are being developed every day that will eventually be used to look even closer at the fibers.
There are plans for more advanced DNA sequencing and new types of chemical analysis.
But the question remains, will the scientific establishment be brave enough to look at the results? Or will they continue to hide behind their uncomfortable silence? The evidence is there, waiting for anyone who is willing to see it. It is a story of blood, light, and mystery, and it is a story that is still being written. Institutional silence was only the beginning of the cover-up.
What if the scientific establishment has secretly known the full truth about the anomalous DNA for years and simply decided the public could not handle it?
Are we missing a key detail? Like and subscribe for more.